Register today for ACR Convergence 2024 and unlock one of the most influential meetings in rheumatology. Hear groundbreaking science and patient perspectives. Network with colleagues and mentors in the poster hall, the Global Rheumatology Summit, or the Ultrasound Conference. Join us for favorite events like the Knowledge Ball and the Thieves Market. Register today at rheumatology.org. ACR Convergence 2024, where rheumatology meets. Hello, and welcome to ACR Journals on Air podcast. I'm your host, Vicky Shamigam. Life happens, but can life events impact one's risk of developing autoimmune disease? We are about to find out. The manuscript we will discuss today is Life Events, Caregiving, and Risk of Autoimmune Rheumatic Diseases in the Women's Health Initiative Observational Study. It was published in Arthritis Care and Research, and a link to the manuscript and disclosures are in our show notes from today. It is a great honor to be joined today by the first author of this study and someone whose work I've admired for years, Dr. Christine Parks. Dr. Parks is an epidemiologist at the National Institute of Environmental and Health Science, NIEHS, one of the 27 institutes and centers at the National Institutes of Health, where I also work. Dr. Parks obtained her master's degree in public health and infectious diseases and her PhD in environmental epidemiology at the University of North Carolina School of Public Health in 2001. And for over 25 years, her research has focused on environmental risk factors for systemic autoimmune diseases, including lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. Welcome to the show, Christine.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really glad to be able to talk with you today.
So stress is all around us. And as rheumatologists, we know anecdotally that many of our patients will report a history of a singular or compounded life events that preceded their onset of their autoimmune disease. But there was more than one anecdote that led you to conduct this study. So can you fill us in on the background data evaluating the impact of stress on autoimmune disease?
Well, we already know that stress is a risk factor for many chronic diseases. It increases allostatic load and acts through various biologic pathways, increasing inflammation and oxidative stress, for example. And when I came to this in autoimmune diseases, there was a broad literature on stress and exacerbation of autoimmune symptoms and disease activity. But the research on stress and disease development was relatively sparse and a little bit contradictory. In recent years, there have been a growing number of studies that have looked at history of trauma, including early life factors, and post-traumatic stress disorder on risk of systemic autoimmune diseases. But when I first reviewed the literature, there were only a couple studies that looked at stressful life events. These included a retrospective study design, and that is subject to recall bias. They were actually diametrically opposed. One said yes, one said no. And this really piqued my interest at a time when I was first discovering the potential of prospective cohorts for studying relatively rare outcomes like lupus and other autoimmune diseases.
Which is great because it leads us right into the Women's Health Initiative Observational Study cohort. What is this study? Who is enrolled in this cohort? And how did you bring your study team together to conduct this analysis?
All right. Well, the cohort is composed of postmenopausal women ages 50 to 79. And this is the observational cohort I'm speaking of. These women were screened for the Women's Health Initiative clinical trials, either hormone therapy or vitamin D and calcium, but they were ineligible either because they were unable for various reasons or unwilling to meet the requirements of the trial. They enrolled between 1993 and 1998 at 40 research centers in the U.S. About 80% of them are white and 90% have at least some post-secondary education. So they're a little bit more higher socioeconomic status, but generally were meant to be somewhat of a control population compared to the trial. So our research team came together based on shared interest in studying systemic rheumatic autoimmune diseases or stress. There were two people specifically who inspired me to work in the WHI. This included Barbara Howard, a PI of one of the research centers who had written a paper in 2004 about the value of the WHI and other cohorts for studying autoimmune disease outcomes. And then Brian Wallet was a rheumatologist who worked with Barbara to perform a validation study on lupus in the cohort. We met at the ACR, and eventually this resulted in my leading 2 papers in the cohort, one on insecticide use, which is a topic I went on to study in other cohorts, including my current work in the agricultural health study, and this new paper on psychosocial stress. When proposals are developed to analyze WHI data and they're approved, then other investigators are invited either by me or by the study to join as collaborators. And this team grew to include epidemiologists and clinicians, all of whom really contributed substantially during development of the manuscript.
So early in the manuscript, you discuss a concept I had not heard of before, the reserve capacity model. Would you mind explaining that concept to our listeners?
This is a great question and a good example of the benefits of having collaborators and reviewers with expertise in stress research. And of course, there are many models, but this particular reverse capacity model is well described in a widely cited paper by Karen Matthews, who's also a WHIPI, along with Linda Gallo, which was published in 2011 in the Annual Reviews of Psychology. Basically, this model integrates both the socioeconomic and psychosocial context underlying a person's response to external stressors. So it's still all external factors, not the internal biologic response. But this model includes both material and tangible factors and personal coping resources, including social support. So an example is not only does lower SES relate to greater experiences of external stressors over the lifespan, which depletes reserve capacity to respond, but it also impacts the ability to rebuild or refill this reserve. So it was a good model for just thinking about some of the factors that I was interested in the original analysis. And this was introduced to me by a co-author during the write-up of the paper, actually. She said, "This is actually what you were doing."
That's great. And what were your hypotheses as you approached the analysis for this paper?
Well, I hypothesized that having a greater burden of recent stressful life events would be related to greater risk of developing rheumatoid arthritis and lupus. So we also wanted to look at caregiving as an understudied stressor in women, often experienced more frequently by middle-aged and older women. So missing from the literature on stress and autoimmune disease. And finally, we wanted to explore whether associations varied by some of these markers in this reserve capacity model, such as occupational class, a marker for socioeconomic status, social support, and age. So that was a secondary hypothesis, but still very important to understanding this relationship.
And so you followed the women in this study for about 3 years. Tell us how your team identified patients who had new autoimmune disease diagnoses during the cohort follow-up, and which specific autoimmune diseases did you study?
So again, this was following up on work initially conducted by Brian Wallet to validate cases. And we ended up deciding to identify cases as individuals who self-reported a diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis during this follow-up period. So they were followed each year and asked questions. And then we limited ourselves to only those who reported using disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs, DMARDs, not prednisone only, because that's fairly nonspecific. But together, this was a definition that was shown to have high specificity for validated lupus and RA. So of the nearly 75,000 women we followed, we found 211 cases who met that criteria in that time frame. Most had RA, but this also included 38 women with lupus, some of whom had both RA and lupus.
And then tell us how you measured stress exposure.
Well, the basic WHI questionnaire asked at enrollment included a standardized life events questionnaire. This included 11 events experienced in the past year. Most common were death of a close friend or family member, major money problems, and major conflict with children or grandchildren. The questions also included physical and verbal abuse by a family member or a close friend. And this was also of interest as an understudied exposure in women's health. So we looked at the overall count of events then, as well as specific subgroups, which we defined as sort of interpersonal, financial stress, and the smaller subgroup of abuse. Another set of questions we looked at asked about regular recent caregiving for a family member or friend, as well as the frequency of such caregiving in the past 4 weeks. What was interesting to me was, it's not unexpected, but between 11 and 20% of women reported caregiving at least 3 days a week. But there was a greater prevalence of this caregiving, of frequent caregiving, among women who also reported 4 or more items on the life event scale. So really kind of co-migrating and part of that acute and chronic stress that we saw. So other relevant data that we included was a standard social support index, which we viewed as a modifying factor, and recent depression symptoms, which, because they may be on the causal pathway, we didn't adjust for, but we used them in our sensitivity analyses.
So tell us a little bit about some of that secondary analysis then. You present a lot of data in the manuscript. You present a number of figures. Would you mind walking our listeners through the data? What did you find? What were the risk factors that compounded risk of life stresses and impacting the probability of developing autoimmune disease?
Well, first of all, I want to emphasize that the secondary analyses the study wasn't really powered to look at these factors. So we focused initially on our main findings. We found that women who reported 3 or more recent life events had a 70% increased risk of developing RA or lupus during follow-up, compared to women who reported none of these during that 12-month period prior to enrollment in the cohort. So we also saw stronger associations for this subgroup reporting physical abuse in the past year, though the number of exposed cases were small. There was a non-significant increased risk in more frequent caregiving, but importantly, these associations were not confounded by sociodemographic factors such as age, race, education, smoking, or body mass index. So the latter two being somewhat coping mechanisms, behavioral factors that are associated with stress response. So in sensitivity analyses, excluding women with baseline joint symptoms or depressive symptoms, these main findings were upheld. And in fact, the findings for caregiving became statistically significant when we excluded women who had baseline joint symptoms. When we considered potential modifying factors in the reserve capacity model, occupational stress, social support, and age, the main effects of the total events, the cumulative total events, were quite similar to what we had seen in the main analysis. So it didn't seem to vary by these factors. However, several of the subgroup associations were more apparent in women with lower occupational status, that is, non-professional or managerial work. Also, they were lower within women who had lower social support or in younger women under age 65. This included financial stress, which was associated with disease risk among women with lower occupational stress and younger women, with the age differences showing statistically significant interactions there. And for verbal and physical abuse, we saw this as well, but there's greater uncertainty due to the small numbers.
And so you're an epidemiologist. You love looking for patterns in data. We know as rheumatologists for years that genetics, no matter which way you slice and dice it, cannot fully explain autoimmune disease risk. How can we use the data you're presenting to better understand biologically what might be happening in the immune system or the immunome that's causing breakdown of immune tolerance in response to stressful life exposures? And based on this data and what you know about the reserve capacity model, is there a way we could potentially study this prospectively?
Oh, yes. And as an epidemiologist, I first want to know whether we can replicate these findings in other populations, especially those with different socioeconomic backgrounds, ages, and those with greater racial and ethnic diversity. So, only then, with efforts of data harmonization, we can develop consortia with greater statistical power, which will allow us to consider those external stressors and modifying factors more easily. We were underpowered in our study in the WHI for those secondary analyses. Then studies with stored biomarker specimens would be particularly important so we can examine biomarkers of the internal stress response, inflammation, and immune dysregulation. I could talk about this all day, but basically, I'll try to keep it short. But to understand the role of stress in the development of autoimmune diseases, we first need to know what stages are vulnerable to stress induced immune perturbation. So, is stress an important causal factor at later stages, triggering or promoting the development of disease among those who are already susceptible, either due to genetics or those with preclinical autoimmunity? That's something that we can look. And these are people who would already have had a break in tolerance, which we know autoantibodies occur many years, often sometimes decades prior to the development of disease. You know, in our study in the WHI, we looked at recent events in the past year and 3 years of follow-up. So to me, that is relating to that disease promotion or triggering of the final clinical development. What are some of the factors associated with that? Probably increased or elevated levels of inflammatory cytokines and so forth. So another question is then whether earlier events or chronic stressors associated with these initial stages of immune dysregulation, loss of tolerance, and development of autoimmunity, whether they play an important role. And that's a little more tricky to get at. That's why we need studies at different ages and stages and cohorts, such as the WHI and the NIHS sister study, which includes 50,000 women with an extensive stress questionnaire and autoimmune outcome data, by the way. These offer opportunities to conduct nested studies of baseline autoantibodies and other immune biomarkers in cases and non-cases, and trying to address the relationship of stressors and modifiers with biomarkers prior to disease onset. Longer follow-up periods are needed as well. In the WHI, we only could look at the first 3 years, while a larger sample of incident cases with updated stress data would really help us dig deeper into the question of the relevant timing and whether there's greater susceptibility among those with lower reserve capacity. In some cohorts, like the NIHS sister study, stress questions have been asked at multiple time points over follow-up. They've also included early life factors, which helps us look at the trajectory of stressors across the lifespan. It's not maybe just the acute events, but a modifying early life situation, repeated acute or chronic stressors, and resulting distress conditions such as PTSD and depression, which may further modify the effects of later stressors and response.
So this is so important and so interesting because I remembered an earlier period in my career when I was doing basic science, animal studies. And I remember this kind of pivotal moment of realizing that perhaps it wasn't an ideal way to study the immune system because, you know, my mice didn't smoke or drink or have difficult bosses or marital problems. And the kind of isolation of just the biology didn't allow for what's really happening in a human. So do you think that this research is really kind of requiring us to merge multiple data sets in order to analyze this problem? Is there ever a way we could have one single data set to look at the real scope of this issue?
That is a really good question. And actually, I was going to talk about that. We need these studies, other types of studies that compare questionnaire data on stress with internal markers of the biologic stress response, including these modifiers, such as in the reserve capacity model, we need to be able to integrate immune markers at different stages during the development of disease. So these may be different studies with different designs. For example, years ago in the sister study, I conducted a cross-sectional analysis of perceived stress, urinary catecholamines, and leukocyte telomere length, which is kind of a marker for, it's studied with respect to many diseases, but really it's a marker of immune aging or effects on the immune system. And shorter telomeres were indeed seen among women with higher perceived stress, but primarily in those who also had elevated catecholamine levels. So that was just one little study that kind of contributed to a larger picture of how these things may be acting together. But new methods are needed. We need to be able to analyze some of the deep phenotyping data that are coming up now. We need to be able to look across multiple platforms and multiple studies, also including experimental research, but altogether being able to understand this relationship as a holistically of the stress exposome and what's going on outside the body, what's going on inside the body, and risk of developing autoimmunity and disease.
Yeah, I think it's so important, and I'm so interested to see kind of where you take this work further. As we mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, and you've brought it up a couple times during our discussion, you've got this large body of work studying both environmental and occupational risks for autoimmune diseases, particularly through the sister study and then also the agricultural health study. I'm going to take this conversation in a different direction now. Can you tell us, how did you start working in this field? And who are the mentors who've guided you, and how have these data sets evolved and grown alongside your career?
Well, that's a really big question, and I'll try to be brief. But when I was thinking about this earlier, when I was first in graduate school at UNC Chapel Hill, I had a mentor named Bob Milliken. He was my first advisor and a cancer researcher, now deceased, but was an amazing scientist. And he was actually the first one who encouraged me to take the leap to work on the Carolina lupus study at NIEHS with Glenda Cooper. This was a comparatively rare disease compared to breast cancer, but it was really an important understudied topic in women's health. And it especially interested me and provided a challenge as I began to study the role of occupational silica exposure, which is usually seen in male-dominated industries. And I really spent a while thinking about occupational exposures after that point. But since then, and many other factors, I was at NIOSH for a while working in that area, and that's actually part of what got me in the stress exposure assessment field as well. I've been working under the guidance of Dale Sandler, who's branch chief at NIHS. She has played a huge role in supporting my research through the sister study and the agricultural health study cohorts. So early on, she engaged my assistance on developing that first stress questionnaire for the sister study, which really inspired my research on that data, trying to look at stress biomarkers and telomere length. Then I went on to conduct studies on early life risk factors and RA and lupus, mostly on pesticides, because we knew that farmers had an increased risk of these diseases, but also including some markers of sociodemographic factors such as young maternal age, food insecurity, and parental education levels. And I'm now collaborating with others who are taking on this line of research in that cohort. Because of the increased risk in farmers, which was an occupational risk factor, I wanted to understand that. And that was one of the first things I looked at in the WHI, where we found insecticide associations with RA and lupus risk. Looked at some of the early exposures and found associations in the sister study. And then over the past several years, I've really been focused on leveraging the extensive pesticide exposure data from the agricultural health study, which is it's a study of like 89,000 licensed pesticide applicators, mostly farmers and their spouses. And I wanted to follow up on these earlier findings to try to tease out the role of specific pesticides and other factors. Farmers have many exposures on the job. And In this cohort, I was given the opportunity to develop and lead a new disease confirmation protocol to screen and validate systemic autoimmune diseases. On this, I worked with Karen Kostenbader from Harvard and the Nurses Health Study, who's been my clinical collaborator since and a personal mentor in this area. And she helped me make sense of the data that we collected as well. Recently, we've expanded to link the cohort to Medicare claims data, and that's provided another opportunity to identify systemic autoimmune disease rates in this older subcohort. And I presented this at last year's ACR meeting in San Diego, and these data also have enabled new and larger studies on pesticides and RA that I've conducted in applicators and spouses. And this is work that has been submitted for publication and also for an abstract at ACR, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with people. Now, why we don't have biomarker data in egg health for the full cohort, but I've been able to collaborate with an NCI colleague to look at pesticides and autoantibodies in a small sub-study of farmers. Now, at the same time, I'm part of a team looking at pesticides and telomere length in that same study. I've been excited also to begin using herpes zoster as a model to study the effects of chronic pesticide exposures on immune effects and the loss of viral latency. This is kind of interesting because stress has also been looked at in relation to herpes zoster. So eventually, putting it all together, we may get a better sense of what specific factors may be contributing to autoimmune disease risk among farmers. So this is the same triangulation that we need to take, be it for pesticides or stress or other exposures, to understand their actual role in disease etiology.
Yeah, and I think it's so important because these things happen at different time points across people's lifespan, and we don't know what that means for the immune system. And the only way to figure that out is to do the type of epidemiologic work that you and others are doing. So thank you so much. Now, you're rooted in North Carolina, which people may not know, but is in fact where the NIEHS campus is located. But your roots go deeper than just your academic work. Your family owns an interesting farm. Now, you are not the first rheumatology farmer on this podcast, but your farm is quite unique. Spill the tea. What do you grow?
Well, I grow tea, of course. And that's actually really rare across the US. This is actually the Camellia sinensis plant, which is the plant that is the origins of all types of traditional teas around the world. Like green tea, black tea, oolong, it's all made from those leaves. So my husband runs a camellia nursery, and about 20 years ago, I began really honing in on tea and the tea plant.
It's fascinating. And amazingly, in addition to your incredible body of academic publications, you've also written a book focused on sharing the joy and health benefits of tea gardening with the world. Tell us about your writing process and what have you learned from growing and drinking lots of tea?
Well, I was first inspired to write this book, which is sort of like, pie in the sky inspiration, along with the co-author as we were traveling to a tea farm in Oregon together. I was thinking of kind of writing a modern history or a guide to tea growing in the US. There had been a history, which a lot of people don't know about previously in past centuries, that's kind of hidden. But the book became a how-to book, and eventually, both with the editor's input and other people. And so this set a higher bar for me advising people on best practices. And the writing process was a bit tricky because as a scientist, I'm used to documenting everything based on peer review research. But a lot of what's known about tea growing was learned hundreds of years ago. Most of what's published in the English language pertain to modern methods of industrial tea production. I was able to come across some research literature, and I continue to head there when I have questions, like, does tea grown in the full sun have more caffeine? And if so, how does it and why does it happen? Show me the research. I even conducted my own informal study interviewing tea farmers across the US and UK about their best practices and experiences getting started as tea farmers, and about 100 tea growers, gardeners, personally, to get a better sense of what was working and what wasn't working for people. So, very informal research. But the challenge really became when I was told by the editors that I had to make my writing less dense and more entertaining. I've never heard that before as a writer in science. So I focused on providing enough information so people could understand the why as much as the how. But the fun part for me, of course, is being out in the garden and making and sharing and drinking tea. So I tried to convey that as well. And it's been fun to meet people over the years as a result of that book.
Yeah, and I had no idea that small garden tea farming was such a big thing, certainly in the United States and indeed in the UK. I'm wondering, did writing that book and kind of getting that feedback from the editors, do you think it influenced how you now write for a scientific audience?
Oh, that's funny. No, I don't think so, because I do try to. I'm really interested now in how we write those little translational blips at the beginning of our studies, sort of boiling things down, but then also in thinking about press releases and how to communicate our findings to the general public. This has definitely been helpful there.
Oh, I like it. Boiling things down. So you're serving us up a little cup of tea at the beginning of those manuscripts now.
Infusing, we say in the business. So infusing the knowledge into the general population, but trying to do it accurately, because science infotainment is also an issue. So I'm trying to be accurate and not overstate things, but help people.
Yeah, you could call it edutainment even, right?
Yeah, edutainment. But, there's a lot out there, a little bit too much. But anyway, we do our best. So
I have to ask, because I do come from a part of the world where pretty much no matter what stressful life event you're facing, a cup of tea is usually the answer. And I'm wondering, is that simply an anecdote, or is there science behind the health benefits of tea drinking?
Well, this broader topic of tea and health is not really in my research wheelhouse, but so I don't talk about it a lot. I try to avoid it whenever asked. But, because I only have personal impressions and a little bit about what I've read, and the literature is extremely deep. But I was fascinated to learn that a unique amino acid, L-theanine, in tea is hypothesized to impact some neuroendocrine responses to stressors. And I've looked at some of the research. It's out there. Caffeine is also certainly known to give a boost, though, as we say, more and better research is always needed, especially on how these two factors interact together. But from a personal perspective, I do believe there really is something about the acute effects of tea behind these common sense prescriptions or feelings for the use of tea in our cultural life.
But tea probably cannot impact or reverse the impact of other stressful life events completely, or kind of give people back additional reserve capacity for handling those life events.
It's hard to know. It hasn't been studied in that respect. The really good experimental research is focused on acute effects, and the studies are small. So I can't comment beyond that at this point as a non-expert in that field.
So we should all accept that more research is needed, both into stressful life events and tea.
and my personal experience is, boy, I wish I'd had a cup of tea before talking this morning. I drank coffee to give me a bigger boost, and a cup of tea might have helped me feel a little bit less nervous,
Oh dear, I hope this wasn't too stressful.
No. But this is my first podcast, so anyway.
Well, so Christine, I want to thank you so much for sharing your gardening, your research, your life experience with us today. And my thanks today also go to those who garden, literally and figuratively, in the field of rheumatology, including the investigators who plant and tend to large data sets, and those who cultivate the careers of budding researchers. Thank you. Thank you all for listening to this podcast. ACR Journals on Air is a production of the American College of Rheumatology. Please follow @ACRheum on social media, email us at podcast@rheumatology.org, and rate and subscribe to our podcast at acrjournalsonair.org or wherever you get your podcasts.